Hello, and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. Data teams everywhere face the same problem. They're forcing ML models, streaming data, and real-time processing through orchestration tools built for simple ETL. The result? Inflexible infrastructure that can't adapt to different workloads. That's why Cash App and Cisco rely on Prefect. Cash App's fraud detection team got what they needed: flexible compute options, isolated environments for custom packages, and seamless data exchange between workflows. Each model runs on the right infrastructure, whether that's high-memory machines or distributed compute. Orchestration is the foundation that determines whether your data team ships or struggles. ETL, ML model training, AI engineering, streaming, Prefect runs it all from ingestion to activation in one platform. Whoop and 1Password also trust Prefect for their data operations. If these industry leaders use Prefect for critical workloads, see what it can do for you at dataengineeringpodcast.com/prefect. Are you tired of data migrations that drag on for months or even years? What if I told you there's a way to cut that timeline by up to a factor of 6 while guaranteeing accuracy? Datafold's Migration Agent is the only AI-powered solution that doesn't just translate your code, it validates every single data point to ensure a perfect parity between your old and new systems. Whether you're moving from Oracle to Snowflake, migrating stored procedures to dbt, or handling complex multi-system migrations, they deliver production-ready code with a guaranteed timeline and fixed price. Stop burning budget on endless consulting hours. Visit dataengineeringpodcast.com/datafold to book a demo and see how they turn months-long migration nightmares into week-long success stories. Your host is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Vijay Subramanian about metric trees and how they empower more effective and adaptive analytics. So Vijay, can you start by introducing yourself?
Hey Tobias, great to be here. I'm Vijay Subramanian. I'm the founder and CEO of a metric tree based analytics startup called Trace.
And do you remember how you first got started working in data?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Back in 2010, I joined a then seed state startup called Rent the Runway to head up all things data. And that became an almost 10-year journey to IPO. And I had like a front row seat to what is now considered the modern data stack, the full birth and the evolution of the modern data stack. And I don't know if you remember back in 2010, the rage at that time was the Hadoop ecosystem. So that's how far back that was. We actually went with Vertica early on. We had a Vertica on-prem data warehouse before we migrated to Snowflake. We had all these custom scripts for data pipelines before we tried this tool called Luigi and finally settled on dbt. And then early on, all of our reporting was just spreadsheets before we moved to Tableau and then Looker. So we were basically the poster child for adopting the modern data stack. And it's precisely for that reason, because I had a front row seat to seeing the innovation that was happening to enable the data producer to be able to ingest data, build the pipelines, maintain the pipelines. But I didn't see as much happening on the consumer side, is exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing now. In fact, I would even argue that enabling the producer almost led to a proliferation of data assets, of dashboards and data models, without regard to the consumer and how they're going to piece together everything in order to make their workflows work. So we're hoping that metric trees is that framework and that platform on which we can regulate this and also really provide value to the end consumer.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely interesting how the late 2010s into the early 2020s was really a sea change in terms of investment in and application of data at a broader scale than what had previously been the case, where for a long time, organizations would have some form of business intelligence. It was generally fairly small scale, limited, focused on a very small set of data sources, largely driven by their core applications. And then the introduction of Hadoop brought in the idea of big data, of just capture everything, and eventually it'll be useful. But the investment required to actually run an operation of that scale meant that it was largely limited to the big tech players and early adopters in the enterprise. And then as we moved later into the late 2010s, things like Redshift and Snowflake helped to reduce the barrier to entry for data warehousing and business intelligence, led to what you mentioned as far as the rise of the modern data stack, as well as introductions of things like Fivetran, Airbyte, all of these data ingest tools that made it easier to onboard new data sources. Yet, to your point, led to this proliferation of data without any real solution of how to actually integrate it and make it useful. And going back to the point of data warehouses, in the 90s, there was the introduction of the Kimball style star schemas. There was Bill Inman with his third normal form data warehousing. I think it was maybe early to mid 2000s was the introduction of Data Vault. So we had all of these frameworks for, in the abstract, how to organize data into reusable structures. But again, that required a lot of investment. It required a team who was very well versed in those practices, as well as being very well versed in the business and how it operated. And I'm wondering if you can, given all that context, describe a bit about how the idea of metric trees fit into this evolutionary ecosystem where we are today with this proliferation of data sources, the challenges of being able to actually activate it, especially now that data is being applied to a much broader range of use cases than just retrospective analytics.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean that was a great timeline there. Yeah, I think in fact I don't know if you followed the timeline. We kind of got away from data modeling for a bit in the modern data stack. We just thought we'll throw all the data in. Compute is cheap, storage is cheap. We'll just run whatever we need to for the business, and we got away from a lot of the principles which I think we're coming back to now. And if you really read those classics, if you read Kimball, Inman, they were actually obsessed with the idea of gathering business requirements in order to do the data modeling. It wasn't just go and build a bunch of data models. Everything derived from what the business needed to do and working backwards to build the data models. So if you look at it through that lens, metry is just simply an evolution of that concept. Because you can imagine going to the growth team and saying, what are your 5 or 6 different output metrics you care about, and what are the factors that drive that? Let's design those become your metric trees. And then now let's work backwards to design the data models you need to populate those metric trees, because you're really going business first before you think about the data. And I think that's from that lens, I think metric trees are a very logical evolution of what data modeling can be. And if I were to sort of like step back and sort of define what metric trees are before we dive, deep into it, that is that producer angle, right? And from a data producer angle, it's just a next evolution of data modeling, right? It's just maybe it's the final frontier of data modeling. From a consumer standpoint, a metric tree can be seen as a metric template that captures the business process or the business model. So, the way I think about it is sort of combine these two concepts. And I like to define metric trees as the data model that captures the business model. So that's sort of how I think about it. And so, yeah, so, why are we doing that, right? Like, what's the purpose of doing all this work? If you could capture the business model through data and you could capture that in code, and all of this work you mentioned, right? I mean, we are spending so much time today, tedious work, manual work, repetitive work, time consuming work, even boring work, trying to understand what is happening to my metrics. Why are they up? Why are they down? How are we performing versus budgets and plans, OKRs? What does the forecast look like if things stay the course? What does the forecast look like if things change? Are my experiments working? Are my features working? What should I be doing if I move this metric X? What does it do to revenue? So, all of these questions that sort of animate the organizations, we could actually start streamlining them in software with this data model that captures the business model. And in fact, the most ambitious vision would be, can we automate them? Because, in sort of like, what if there are a certain set of metric tree templates that govern the various business models in the world? And what if there is a finite contained list of analytical operations or functions, if you will, that can be applied to the metric trees that can actually power the workflows that users need? What if that were true, right? That's sort of, I think, the where I think I'm excited about the purpose of metric trees.
And metric trees are another layer that builds on top of those dimensional structural elements of warehousing. And in terms of the nomenclature, they beg a comparison to the introduction of the idea of the metric layer, also known as the semantic layer, also known as headless BI, that became popular in the 2021 to 2022 timeframe and gained a lot of popularity in the initial introduction, has since faded a little bit in terms of the hype around it, but is still very much part of the data ecosystem. And I'm wondering if you can talk to the ways that the work that you're doing with this idea of metric trees relates to the principles as well as maybe the technology layers that were brought in with those concepts of the metric layer or the semantic layer.
Yeah, maybe the best way to illustrate this might be just an example so we can make this whole thing more concrete for us, for the audience. So let's take Uber or Lyft because we all know that how they operate. And in Uber or Lyft, the key metrics would be number of rides, number of riders, revenue, right? And if you had a semantic layer or a metrics layer where you could define these metrics, you could then ask that system to give you, hey, give me the number of rides in New York City in the month of September, and that system will generate the SQL and give you the output, right? That's sort of the purpose of a metric layer or semantic layer. In a metric tree formulation of this problem, you would define, individual metrics don't really play a role, right? Because you're defining the metric tree and the output metric, let's say, is revenue, and you would define that as a function of number of rides, ride frequency, average price of the ride, maybe a promotion rate if that's applied, the take rate that Uber takes, right? One minus the commission that they're paying to the drivers. So you express this function and you say these five, six different things ladder up to this thing called revenue. Now that's what a metric tree is. Now you can obviously see that a metric layer, if you already have built it, that could be an input to hydrating and populating a metric tree, right? So if you already have defined this metric layer and you could access that in a nice way, then you could populate the metric tree. But you also don't need a metric layer to populate a metric tree because you can define a metric tree and you could push a lot of these metric definitions into the metric tree system itself. You don't need a separate layer to define the metrics in order to populate that. So the way I sort of think about this concept is like, if there is a standardization in the ecosystem where there is a standard metric layer, then yeah, that can be consumed to hydrate and populate the metric tree, but you don't necessarily need that in order for a metric tree to operate on its own. And I should make this point because there's also a question of purpose here, right? A metric layer's purpose is almost sort of self-evident, right? You define the metric and then you ask for the metric and it gives you the metric, and that ends the purpose. Whereas a metric tree, if you simply hydrate the metric tree, that is not sufficient, in my opinion, to derive value. It's just a visualization of a bunch of metrics in a canvas with a bunch of boxes, right? I don't think the value is yet realized unless you're building these analytical functions I spoke about, and unless you're building a real workflow around it. So I do think there's a lot more to be built around metric trees than what the metric layer ecosystem today has.
Another interesting aspect of this question of metrics, particularly in juxtaposition to those dimensional schemas that have been the bread and butter of data warehousing for the past 30 years now, is if you're doing the dimensional modeling correctly, then why do you even need a separate representation of metrics? And it also introduces comparisons to things such as the differentiation between a data warehouse and an OLAP server, as well as comparison to practices such as master data management, as well as data governance policies and how that reflects to the technical representation. And just the idea being that raw data is only useful if you contextualize it. The way that you contextualize it is to compare it to the questions of business process. And then the canonical example of why you need effective definitions of metrics is that different people across the business have a different concept of what a specific phrase might mean, where customer has a different meaning to a marketing team versus a finance team versus a sales team. And so the business events that cause somebody to go from a prospect to a customer have different thresholds across those different use cases. And I'm wondering if you can just maybe wrap that all together and explain why just the practice of dimensional data modeling is not sufficient, or what are some of the aspects of that as a general practice and policy that leave gaps that necessitate the introduction of a new concept and a new technology layer.
Totally. I think this sort of, yeah, to just wrap everything, I think it really gets down to sort of the purpose question. The Kimball framework, the Inman framework, they were all designed to thoughtfully build data models with the use case being that a business is able to retrieve flexible calculations of metrics, right? Inside like some BI tool, for example. So yeah, so give me revenue in New York City for Uber, right? Give me rides, give me riders, give me for September, give me the rolling 28 days, cut it by UberX versus Uber Share, like all of these various cuts can all be provided in a well-governed way. But that was the end purpose. The purpose is, can I generate these metrics, which is really what the metric layer is also in a sense trying to do, right? If you look at it through that lens, the metric layer is just a formalization of, on top of Kimball, a structure that also captures the metrics itself as a concept. So it's not just facts and events and dimensions, it's also metrics and dimensions. It's just like it's one layer further up in terms of abstraction. Whereas I think of metric tree as really getting as close to the business model as you can. So back to that point of it being a data model that captures the business model. And now that is a backend on which we can build analytical functions that can actually directly affect the workflows of the work that's being done around data in the organization. So I don't think like Kimball there was any drawback to that. It's just like that framework was useful to generate metrics. And now we're talking about users want to activate the data, to use your phrase. They want to use the data, they want to get insights quickly, they want to make decisions quickly. And how do we make all that happen? And the answer is, we got to keep pushing the abstraction, keep pushing the frontier of modeling forward. And that's where metric trees really fit in.
And so, digging into that purpose and the definition of the metrics and their relations and how that factors into the questions that the business is asking and needs answers to, what are some of the strategies that you have found most effective and that you recommend for teams who are in the early stages of trying to adopt metric trees and understand what are the definitions, how do they relate to each other, how do they ladder up from the very fine-grained events into the more abstracted, contextualized business questions that are being asked about the data that underlies those calculations?
That's a really interesting question, because if you talk to business folks, and I helped a startup go from seed stage to IPO, so worked with the business extremely closely. And you talk to any business folk, and you talk to them about, what are the drivers, what are the input levers you have, what are the output metrics, the KPIs, and have this conversation. You will realize very quickly that they already have a rough mental model that kind of looks like a metric tree. If you were to think about it in that context, they wouldn't call it a metric tree. They definitely don't have it fleshed out and thought through and refined it, but they're already thinking of the connections. They think of these metrics that they are tracking and how they're sort of connected. And that's what they're trying to accomplish when they log into a BI tool and look at a metric and then hop into another dashboard and apply a filter and look at that metric. And so they're kind of like dancing around these dashboards or spreadsheets in a way, sort of tracing the connections between the metrics, because they know these are all laddering up to something important, right? And there's some connections between them. So really the job to be done here is not anything radically new, but it is sort of like, in fact, pushing the frontier of how Kimball and Inmans and those classics thought about it, is like, can we work with the business to define and flesh out how they really think about all the different metrics and the levers and how it ladders up to the outcomes that they care about? Because really, in a sense, the reason why the dashboards have proliferated is because they're sort of like making these requirements come piecemeal. Hey, give me this cut of this data, give me this cut of that metric, and then it starts to grow and grow. But really, there is a connective tissue underlying all of that, which actually is a framework in which they're thinking about, what are the input levers, what am I moving, what metrics are moving in the output layer. So I think the job to be done is relatively simple, but simple to say, but kind of hard to do in an organization, which is really have a very active conversation between data teams and business teams and flesh out what are the metrics, how are they connected, what are your levers, what are your outputs, and keep refining that mental model as you learn more and more about the business. That's the job to be done. In fact, by the way, a financial P&L, which is probably one of the oldest data models you've ever built, is actually a metric tree. It just ladders up a bunch of concepts to drive in the net, margin and EBITDA. It might be the OG metric tree, right? A financial model, a financial P&L. And if you go to any FP&A team at any reasonable scale of an organization, they have a sophisticated financial model and they're operating on that because it describes how they make money, how cash flows. And so all we're talking about here is taking that model, taking that discipline, and making and ensuring that we can do that at all these different functions, sales and marketing and product growth, if you exec team and how they think about metrics. So just taking the discipline of modeling the business at all these various functions, operations, right, and making that come to life is really what we're talking about here, and working with the business on that.
You mentioned too that a dedicated metrics layer as a separate technology implementation is not a requirement for creating and using metric trees. And I'm curious what your overall recommendations are as far as the storage and technology implementation of the metric tree. Is it just another set of tables within an overarching data warehouse? Is there some other access layer or security layer, or what are some of the considerations to go into as you're starting to think about, okay, well, metric trees as a practice seem beneficial. I'm going to go ahead and define what are the different calculations and how they roll up into the top level events that I care about for being able to then also support this drill down approach, and just some of the overall planning and implementation details that go into actually creating and activating these metric trees in the business context.
I should mention upfront that we're very early in this, and we're trying to we're going to figure all this out as the market evolves. I think it's a very important question that you just asked, because it gets to the utility question, like why are we doing this work? Why are we storing metric trees? What are we generating? How are we retrieving it? What are we going to do with it? And I think it goes back to the point I made earlier about the analytical functions that we can operate on top of the metric trees to provide value to the business, right? So through that lens, I mean, maybe the best way to think about this is, let's just do an example again. Let's go back to the Uber example, and let's assume you had a metric tree of revenue with these terms, right? Rides, right? Frequency, average price, commission rate, etc. And let's say revenue is down 5%, and you want to understand why. Well, what is driving that? So you have to first now apply an analytical function to see which of these terms are driving that 5%. And so now let's assume that the right frequency is the driver, and that's explaining 4.3 of the 5%, hypothetically. You may want to go to the right frequency and say, well, how does it vary by all these various markets, right? New York, or in the US, globally. And when you do that, you also may want to know, is it because you have certain markets where the frequency is going down? That's where the frequency is going down. Or is it because markets are shifting around? And a higher frequency market like New York is going down in market share, and a lower frequency is going up, and that shift alone is causing the overall right frequency to go down, right? So these are the things that the business wants to understand instantly. So to do that, take that question and now apply it in terms of how you would think about storing and retrieving metric trees. You need to first define the core revenue tree, save that somewhere. Okay, this revenue tree has these terms. You need to be able to apply an analytical function to that to figure out which is the term that's driving that. Then take that term and mutate the tree, because you're now saying, okay, let me take the order frequency and mutate it and further decompose it, if you will, into all the different markets, or maybe into Uber X and Uber share, right? So you want to mutate and then apply another function to further explain, what is causing the frequency to go down. So you can see that if you really look at it this way, it is not sufficient to just generate the metrics and populate the metric tree. You really need to think of the metric tree almost as a backend. The metric tree data model is almost like a backend to a system, to a software system, in order to empower the workflows for the consumer. And I make this point because I have definitely seen out there people talk about metric trees, and you can see a visualization of a bunch of boxes of metrics and arrows, and they're populated. Yes, you can run SQL through them and populate these boxes. And there's some value to that, to seeing all the metrics in one place. You can think of it almost as a dashboard of dashboards, right? You have all the different dashboards in one dashboard. But I think the utility is fairly limited unless you're operating on it, unless you treat it unless you can apply analytical functions to it, unless you can mutate it, unless you can do things with it in an interactive system. So my view of it is that's why I said, metric layers can be useful as a mechanism to populate the data, but ultimately you have to treat the metric tree itself as a key data artifact that can be a backend of a larger system.
To your point of the metric tree being something that can be used as a dashboard of dashboards, it also brings up the question of what are the systems that are going to be interacting with the metric tree? Is this just an optimization to the business intelligence dashboard where you're doing this retrospective analysis, or maybe you're using some sort of forecasting model to give projections in the dashboard, but ultimately it's a very static and manual process of interacting with that data? Or do you see metric trees as something that feeds into a broader range of data consumption use cases? And what are some of the ways that you're seeing metric trees feeding into the broader applications of data, maybe beyond just these static dashboard focused use cases?
Yeah, that's sort of the key question here. Like, how are things going to play out? I think so. The way I'm thinking about it again is like, well, let's take all the workflows that users want to do, and let's try to use metric tree as a backend that we can use to empower these workflows. Can we automate them? Right. That's sort of the ambitious take here. Can we automate this work? How much can we automate? So in that sense, yeah, it is almost like we're taking all the work that's being done today manually in within BI tools or spreadsheets and all of these things, and we can build workflows around it. Now, so does that mean that the metadata will be a backend that feeds into existing tools and they're going to adapt that framework, or is it that we need a new set of tools that will do these functions that we're talking about, right? Obviously, our vision is that we want to be that place where we can do all those functions, but you never really know how it's going to play out. I mean, you already know that there are players out there, like older tools, like maybe even take a mix panel, for example, a tool that does web analytics, broad analytics, and they are releasing metric tree into that framework, right? So we just have to see how this all plays out, like whether this is another input into another tool, or whether this actually can be a net new thing on top of the BI infrastructure. My honestly, if you had asked me for my grandest vision, I would say this probably supplants BI, because BI had its the BI as it formulated today, which is a catalog of metric dashboards that can be created and disseminated, will be replaced by analytical functions that are directly embedded within the business users workflow. And what does that look like? That's, I think, what metric trees can enable, and we have to see how that all plays out.
Because of the fact that metric trees have that relational aspect to them as well, relational in terms of the graph sense, not just the relational database sense. It introduces comparison to things like GraphRag, where the introduction of a graph and the connections and the relationships that objects have to each other enhances the ability for things like generative AI models to perform better reasoning tasks across that underlying data asset. And I'm wondering how you're seeing the utility of metric trees as a means of context engineering and context management for these generative AI cases that are maybe doing some of that question answering, whether that's text to SQL or talk to your data use cases, or if it's something where you're using those ML or those AI models to generate new derived data assets using those metric elements as context to understand what is the actual resulting context that it outputs beyond just being some scalar value.
That's a super exciting topic. We've been chasing this holy grail of self serve in data for a long time. And what's interesting to me is how self serve has always been formulated as self serve data, right? You're going to have a business user be able to ask some question to retrieve some custom data set, and this backend system is going to find the right tables and do the right joins and aggregations and filters and write the SQL and give you back a data set that satisfies your request. But the interaction is still like, give me some data. And I can tell you, I've been in this space for 2 decades now, and the vast majority of business folks really do not want to spend hours poring over data sets, trying to make sense of it, doing their own analysis. They just want very contextual insights into what they need at that moment. What is working, what's not working, what do I do next? So through that lens, I'm thinking that this text to SQL, ask, chat with your data kind of formulation of AI is much more in that vein, right? Like, I can ask the question and then AI is now going and doing all this work and it generates the SQL and gives you the data. But is that really the right problem to be solving? I'm really not convinced, honestly. Not to mention the complexities of doing this in a deterministic, reliable way and making sure that the numbers you're generating are accurate. Is that even the right problem to be solving? So the way I'm thinking about generative AI is, can these let's just use the word agents, because we haven't used the word agents in almost half an hour in a podcast, and that's criminal, right? So we got to say AI agents. So I'm thinking of AI almost as, if you give it this graph, as you said, all of the graph which actually represents the business model. Here are these, like, 15 different ways in which the business thinks about its metrics and how they all relate to each other, and you give it access to the analytical functions we talked about. Can different agents, blend these two concepts together and perform workflows for the business user? So that is the vision that I'm actually pretty excited about. That AI is not necessarily in the business of going to the raw data and trying to write some SQL and generate some data, but it's actually using the framework of how the business thinks about metrics and the kind of operations that need to happen, and is sort of cobbling these together to drive a workflow for the business user. So that's sort of the vision that we want to work towards, and I think is probably the more exciting problem to be solving than can we do some text to SQL and give the business user some data sets.
The other aspect of this is, as you mentioned, there is a purpose to this, but it's also not free. It requires work in terms of the initial definition and creation of these metric trees and the underlying metrics and the computation and derivation and storage thereof. It also, once you have it in place, requires ongoing maintenance and monitoring and validation, as well as occasional pruning, as either you discover that an initial metric that you thought was useful turns out to not be useful, or the business evolves such that those metrics are no longer relevant to the questions that are being actively asked and sought after. And I'm wondering if you can just talk to some of that overall life cycle and workflow management of metric trees, and maybe some of the places where you're seeing the responsibility lie in the organizational structure of the investment in and maintenance of those metric trees as a core organizational data asset.
Yeah, so I think the producer angle is probably a bit more clear and straightforward. So because you can think of the metric tree artifact as an extension of the data pipeline, if you will. So you have your ingest, you build your dimensional models, which we talked about. You have your facts, your dimensions, and while a metric layer will build maybe metric cubes, for lack of a better word, a metric tree is building a metric tree cube. It's just generating all these different metrics and how they relate to each other, and that could be viewed as an extension of the existing data models that are being generated. So through that lens, the creation, the maintenance of these assets will follow sort of the same principles that's already been established in the data domain. You care about things like, is the data up to date? Is it fresh? Is it running reliably? Is it accurate? And so it's sort of the same ideas that we've been working on for the last decade will still apply to those assets. Now, again, if you wanted to think about, what if I change the metric tree? What if I build a new metric tree? So the same sort of ideas will apply, right? Now you have to generate a new asset. Can you borrow from existing nodes in the metric tree into this new metric tree? Can I, as opposed to recreating the business logic again for that? So the same ideas again will apply there, because you can think of a metric tree actually, because it is a graph. It has DAG like properties. So if you're deriving a second metric tree that can be derived from the first two metric trees, then you want to be able to borrow those nodes, so you don't have to rerun the data for those nodes. So in a sense, actually, it kind of like falls nicely within the work that we've been doing for the last decade, and builds nicely on those principles.
Digging now into some of the challenges and edge cases of metric trees, it's definitely very easy to see the value when you have clearly defined hierarchies of events that roll up into one another, or things that are easily attributable based on a cause and effect relationship. But in business, as in life, there are numerous situations where you maybe have a correlation but not a causation, but you still want to try to understand what are the correlated activities that roll up into some higher order insight. And I'm wondering if you can just talk through some of the ways that you think through how to manage some of those fuzzier relations of events and how they roll up into metrics, and some of the non-deterministic but at least tangentially related business events that you want to be able to report on.
Yeah, I mean, I do get that question a lot, and it's surprising how often it comes up in conceptual thinking, but when you go and work with the business, you realize that 95% of how they are operating the business is actually modelable through relationships, whether it's mathematical, whether it's to dimensional cuts or what have you. So yeah, I mean, I would probably put that in the category of the known unknowns, to use a Rumsfeld phrase. There might be metrics that are floating around that you don't know how they relate to each other. By the way, they may or may not have a relationship to each other, and there might even be unknown unknowns, right? Things that are related that you don't know yet. If the way we are, the way we think about that is that you can definitely, the best that humans can do at this point is put them on a tool and try to run, as you said, correlations and regressions and see if there are relationships there. If you can come up with a tool that automatically figures out causality, then I think we're approaching AGI, right? Because you basically can have a metric tree that models the business, and there is this machine that's basically figuring out what is driving the business and starts moving the levers automatically. So that would be an extremely exciting time to live in, but I don't think we're anywhere close to that right now. So yeah, so while metric trees can sort of hint at causality, I mean, as you said, we're very much at this point focused on modeling the known relationships, and the best we can do for the unknowns is to try to regress and come up with some metrics, for lack of a better word. But it's not at this point like a tool where you can automatically just divine causality, right? Because that's an incredibly hard problem.
There's definitely no magic bullet, as you said. And so, from what I'm gathering of your response, there's no definitive way for you to be able to intuit those correlations, but building on top of the core principles of metric trees and their definition, you can create the relations as you go through the process of defining how they fit into the overall business processes. But I'm wondering if maybe there are some of the primitives in terms of how you think about the definition of metric trees that maybe conveys some of the level of uncertainty or the level of a lack of a strict deterministic relationship between those two metrics that can be reflected in the resultant analysis or the resultant display and presentation of that information.
Right. You're just referring to the fact that we want to be careful not to imply a relationship when the relationship may not be there, right? Yeah, I mean, this happens a lot even in when the financial team builds a financial model. They'll just go in and say, what if I move this cell? The output metric changes because you've expressed relationship, but is that actually valid at all times? It may not be valid in the future. Like if you throw more money on paid marketing, it doesn't mean you're going to grow revenue proportionally. You expect the conversion rates to go down, right? So I think what is probably what you may be hinting at, I would think about it differently. I don't think it's that the relationship is. I don't think the relationship is completely unknown and it's completely confusing or fuzzy. I think it's that the relationships are changing over time. That there may be boundaries within which they apply and boundaries where they may not apply. So if you think about the example I was saying, as you spend more money, maybe you expect another metric to go down, and then there's a net result of that, which is your cost of acquisition. So I do think we can model those kind of concepts in the product, right? We can say, okay, we know that these two metrics ladder up to this output metric, and we know that, but these two metrics tend to go in the inverse direction of that. As you spend more money, the other one goes down, right? But is that, by the way, is that true for every company at every regime? Probably not. This, in some regimes, you probably can spend more money, and you probably still can grow successfully at the same profitable rate. So there's definitely some contextual aspects of this that are not as straightforward in just the mathematical expressions itself, but the concepts that these metrics can behave in certain ways in relation to each other can be expressed. But the key is to get the relationship modeled in the first place, I think, because that's what's not happening today. I don't think we're expressing relationships as explicitly on paper for the organization to align and have a discussion around that. And this metric is just a way to force that conversation. And I don't even mean that for things that are related like cost of acquisition and spend and conversion rate. I mean even for metrics that you think are related, right? If I improve my customer service response time, I'm going to drive retention of my customers. Those are too fuzzy. It's not, there's no mathematical relationship. It's sort of implicitly there, but people will talk about it. But who actually goes in and takes those two metrics and runs a regression today actively? Not a lot of companies actually. You'd be surprised. So a lot of the discussions happen in theory. They say, "Hey, if I think this will be affecting that, so I'm going to go work on this," but you don't actually express it and try to run something to validate or invalidate it. So I just think of this ultimately as a way to just start forcing these conversations, putting these things on paper. Let's actually see if there is a regression, even if it's not causation. Let's say is there even a correlation between customer response time and retention rate, right? Let's actually prove let's see what the data says. So yeah, that's kind of how I think about it. That this is just a forcing function to align the business and the execs and the data teams around the metrics that matter, and then the actual analytical functions and the causality and those hard things will just follow over time.
That brings up an interesting question, too, as far as the behavioral impact of having metric trees as a more declarative representation of the cause and effect of different business activities and the ability to be able to do some of that analysis, and also maybe how that fits into some of the patterns around experimentation, both in terms of technical systems, as doing things like A/B testing of different features, as well as organizational practices of saying, hey, we're going to experiment with maybe changing the allocation of our salespeople and the regions and how we define those regions, and seeing how that impacts the overall outcomes, and maybe forcing that into, before you embark upon those experience, maybe doing some of that definition of, okay, well, we think that doing this activity is going to have this outcome, but before we bother making that change, let's go ahead and do that definition of these metric relations so that we can get a more clear before and after picture and see what is the actual causation and not just correlation.
That's an excellent point, actually, right? Because the bleeding edge companies that are operating on data, who are, let's say, running and they can afford to run experiments at scale, do think about this all the time, right? What is driving what? Can we isolate the impacts? Can we run an A/B test? And we're only a small select group of people are doing that today. And I think in a sense I'm hoping the metric tree is a simple but still a more accessible and a more intuitive way that it's able to it enables the business and the data teams and exec teams to have this conversation, and you don't necessarily need a cutting edge data science team doing experimentation for that, right? It just becomes part of how they talk about everything, as opposed to just give me this dashboard.
And building in your work of building a business focused on metric trees as this core data asset and encouraging its use in organizational exploration of their practices, what are some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected ways that you've either seen metric trees used or implemented?
Yeah, I mean, when we started working on this, I of course we knew that the most obvious metrics would be time series metrics like revenue and users and whatnot, and that is still the case. But we have built a bunch of customer journeys, for lack of a better word. You take a cohort and you track how they evolve over time in order to ultimately ladder up to some lifetime value, or just like we're modeling all the critical junctures of a customer and what the business actually wants them to do, right, versus what they're actually doing. Which, if you think about it, is actually really a very pragmatic way to think about levers, because ultimately you're building something to facilitate a customer's existing demand or try to change their behavior on the margin, or radically. So I found that to be a pretty interesting use case of building a tree, is to track a customer journey over time. Which as businesses we've all done those, but to see that in a tree format is pretty powerful.
And as you have been digging into this ecosystem and building a company around it, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process?
Wow, yeah. So I think honestly I've been surprised by a few things. One is because I was a practitioner myself for a decade, and as I talk to a lot of companies now, I am surprised with all this focus on data and the investments that have gone into it. I am surprised how many companies are still early in their journey on metrics maturity, for lack of a better word, knowing deeply how their metrics connect to each other and what the drivers are, what the hypotheses around the drivers are. I've been surprised by that because I think it sort of reflects my original point at the very beginning is like so much focus has happened on can we ingest all the data? Can we put them in a place? Can we make it accessible? And I don't think enough time has been spent on what is the business model. Are we capturing it? Are we understanding the drivers? And I know I'm sounding saying something very obvious, but I've been surprised by that conversation I've been having with organizations, which has not even been a function of the company size or scale, right? Even large companies, I'm finding that to be the case. The other thing that is surprising me is like, I'll come across two companies that are very similar to each other, and they will talk about some overlapping metrics, but they do think about these metric trees and these templates quite differently, which I found fascinating as well. It's pretty much the same business model, and I can clearly see one company is doing a better job of expressing it than the other one. I can see the differences. So all this to say is like I've been sort of just generally surprised at the maturity curve and the standardization, if you will, of metrics and how people think about it. And because that's the lifeblood of data, right? That's what data is really for, is to capture the business. So which just means there's a lot of opportunity out there to for organizations to level up and really spend their time on this problem, and also level up in terms of building your metrics in a way that actually is best of breed for your business model. And it's not a discussion that happens a lot publicly. Maybe it's because companies believe they might have an arbitrage opportunity here. I don't know, but that part of the equation is just not discussed as much as we discuss what database we're using and what BI tool we're using, right? So that's been interesting to observe.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting as you're talking about the ways that the businesses, even if they're effectively doing the same thing, are going to reflect their metric trees in different ways because they think about their business in different ways. And the lack of maybe standardization or componentization of those metric trees, it also brings to mind the work that, for instance, companies like Segment were trying to do or are trying to do in the realm of things like customer data platforms, where you say, oh, you're a business that is working in e-commerce, so we're going to presume that you're using Shopify and HubSpot and Marketo or whatever, and so we're going to standardize the way that we ingest those data sets and the way that we generate the schemas, and so we're going to try and create a one size fits all solution for this segment of a business or this style of industry, and how that over the many times and many versions of that effort that have happened over the past several decades, it never actually quite works because everybody has a different way that they're thinking about their data, and maybe they're able to get some initial value from that out of the box standardized set of visualizations and reports. They always want to ask different questions than their neighbor who's doing the same thing. And so it's just an interesting perspective and an interesting insight into the fact that even if it's the same business, it's not going to operate the same way.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point. So is the question really is like, is it because they have different strategies and tactics to drive what they're doing that the way they think about how the metrics connect to each other is different? Or is one of them doing something wrong and the other is doing it right? And I think this is sort of the interesting question. And this is obviously independent of the data sources, in which I think you were talking about, can you standardize the data models? Because that I can see being very complicated because there are edge cases, right? You need two customers in the same business to be using exactly the same data sources end to end, and it's always the tail that gets you. Even if you use Shopify for your main reporting, there's probably this additional tool using for customer service that the other company is not, and now that whole premise that you can build a unified data model sort of breaks, I think. At least that's my 2 cents on it. Whereas on the consumption side, I'm actually intrigued, like why is it that two companies in the same business are thinking about it differently? And maybe it is the fact that they have different approaches to how they want to grow, and both might be valid for the phases of the company that they are at. But yeah, but I've been definitely been surprised by seeing. But I also will say I also see a hierarchy for sure. I don't think it's not necessarily A and B are different. I do see some companies are much more mature and thoughtful. They've thought about how their business works in a much deeper way than the other company. And I don't think that has anything to do with tooling. I think it's just I think it's a people thing. Honestly, I think it's just the individuals there are have been thinking about this, and they are thinking about things at a deeper level than the other organization, for whatever the case might be. That would be my humble hypothesis, because I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also maybe just a factor of people wanting to be contrary and not being pigeonholed and saying, no, even if you have these out of the box reports and maybe they're useful, I want to think about it differently. And so I'm going to do the work to customize it because I have my own opinions about
Right. So we're creating work to give ourselves value, is what you're saying.
it.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, as people become aware of and explore the idea of metric trees, what are the situations where you would say that that is the wrong abstraction and they should just lean on standard dimensional models, or maybe there's some other approach to determining that causation or determining the appropriate context for a given business process?
Yeah, I mean, wrong might be a strong word, but I've definitely come across conversations where it might be either overkill or just fundamentally not interesting or applicable. Maybe that's sort of a better way of thinking about it for me. Like a few weeks ago, I had a conversation with someone who has a early stage startup and they are running like a few hundred projects, and these projects go through complicated steps to lead to an outcome in the end where they realize the revenue in the physical world, and they were interested in the idea of modeling that through metric trees so we can identify bottlenecks and optimize the process. Yes, we could do that, right? We could do that. That's certainly doable. But my gut reaction was like, you have 100 projects, just put that into a spreadsheet and pivot your way to glory. Maybe I was wrong, but that was my gut reaction. Is like, do you really want to build a metric tree? And maybe there's more a reaction of the effort it takes to get something up and running. Maybe I don't know what it is, but I felt a gut reaction that maybe it's overkill right now for you to do this. In terms of applicability, I think it really comes down to, I think, the business model itself, right? I've definitely come across business models where let's say you're highly partnership driven and you have a few deals that drives your business. It's really not the best use case for even metrics in the first place, right? I mean, even metrics are not that useful fundamentally. Like, what are you tracking really? And consequently, metric trees and metric layers are also not very useful. So you do need, I guess, some level of data volume and some level of breadth and complexity that the business can be measured through data for it to start becoming useful. And that's where I think, like, I've come across cases where it's probably overkill or just not applicable at all.
And as you continue to explore and popularize and define this concept of metric trees, what are some of the things you have planned for the near to medium term, either just as far as metric trees and how to think about and popularize them, or the work that you're doing at Trace to make them operational?
Yeah, I mean, I have to go back to this formulation I had of these analytical functions. So a big vector on our roadmap is to keep building out these functions and these use cases. It's one thing to do retrospective trend analysis. It's one thing to then do how am I doing versus my budgets, right? It's a different kind of analysis, and you're doing a variance analysis. It's one thing to then compare how is my channel A and channel B doing. It's one thing to report on experiment outputs, an A/B test output. So we're really focused on these analytical functions or workflows or what have you. The other vector which I'm genuinely excited about, not because everyone's talking about it, is the use of AI agents. I keep thinking that if we have this abstraction that captures the business model and it's already hydrated through data, it's already sitting there, and I have these functions that I know people want, I mean, it seems like the perfect tailor-made case for an agent to figure out how to combine them on demand for a business user's request, and maybe in the future even connect to some activation tool, right? As you mentioned, maybe it leads to some action in some tool and that can all be orchestrated in a layer where you no longer, and in the long run, maybe there is no such thing as static dashboards, and everything is a fluid system of agents figuring out the business drivers and starting to push the users into taking action. So that's a super exciting, obviously, vision that I can paint, but the making it reality is going to be incredibly hard. So we are starting to take baby steps in that direction as well.
Are there any other aspects of this overall concept and application of metric trees that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
Yeah, maybe the one aspect that sort of jumps to me is I do, and I may have made this point earlier, but when I do talk to folks in the wild who have never heard this term before, and I start describing it, their first reaction is like that it's a visualization, right? We're gonna draw some boxes and You can do that in a canvas tool, you can do that in Miro or Mural, you can draw boxes. Okay, now let's say the boxes can be hydrated with some data. Maybe you can, by the way, I've seen people do that in spreadsheets, right? You just draw some boxes and then in that cell you have a SQL query running or something, and you have some data, with some data populated. And it's sort of, they can do that, and then they ask themselves like, okay, let's say I do that, let's say I visualize it, that's cool, now I can have a dashboard of dashboards, I can see them all in one place. But then they start to hit the question of like, what is the value, right? What is the long term value? Is there sustainable value? These are all very important questions. So I do want to make the point again that our realization is that the visualization is interesting and useful as an alignment vehicle. But I think the real value is going to be when that can serve as a backend to a system where you can actually operate on them and you can actually build workflows around them. So that's kind of what I'm really excited about. And I think that's not super obvious in the discourse around metric trees. It's just seen as like, oh, yet another visualization. We have tables, we have charts, and now we have a graph. And I'm like, yes, that is true on the surface, superficially, but I think there's a lot more to it. And there's a lot more complexity to making that real thing inside organizations. And that's kind of why we're doing what we're doing. Otherwise, why would I be building a company around? So, yeah.
All right. Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you and your team are doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as the final question, I'd like to get your perspective on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today.
Well, I mean, no surprise here. I feel that we have spent enormous effort and will continue to on how we ingest data and clean data and build pipelines and monitor them and maintain them. I think to me, I hope the next decade is really about how do we activate, which I love the word, by the way. I think I'm gonna borrow that. How do we activate data? How do we make it operational? How do we make it useful? Can we build an operating system for business folks, right? So it's not just self-serving data, but they can actually do workflows around data. So that's sort of the thing that I think is the biggest gap. That's why companies they build data teams and they invest millions of dollars, and the execs feel still frustrated, honestly, because I think that's the gap that I don't think people are able to quite articulate. And I also think the problem is interpreted incorrectly. The execs think like, we built all this thing, now data should just tell me what to do, which is not how data works, right? It's a reflection of reality. It's not a cause. As I said, if in the magic world where it can causally find the drivers, then you're reaching AGI, right? So I don't think that's data's job today. I think it's to reflect the business and help you be smarter and more thoughtful in how you operate the business and the levers. So I think that's the biggest gap, is how do we make it useful and operational where people feel the value day in and day out. And honestly, at a point maybe where it becomes almost invisible. Can we aspire to a world where you don't have these dashboards of numbers and cells floating around and it's just invisible in the way the business operates? That I think is sort of the goal I want us to work towards. I mean, is it achievable in our lifetimes? I don't know, but that's what I want to aspire to, where data feels as invisible as software and AI or whatever frameworks du jour that we're dealing with today.
And I think, too, on that point of breaking out of the static dashboard mindset, I've also been seeing some recent work as far as moving that analytical and question asking and answering workflow into more of the communication platforms of the company, where the data analysis is happening using agentic workflows in the context of Slack, where you can talk to an agent and say, hey, I'm curious about the sales numbers from last week and how they correlate with the number of calls that my salespeople made or what have you. And then the agent is able to, using some of these contextual cues, such as the work being done with metric trees, retrieve that information, generate an analysis, summarize it, provide a visualization on demand in a fashion where it also invites other people in the business to be able to participate, rather than dashboards being more of a single player option of everybody can look at the same dashboard, but they're doing it in isolation unless they all happen to be in the same room at the same time talking about it. And just bringing that more into a contextualized and conversational workflow, I think is an interesting evolution that we're going through now as well.
Totally. Yeah. I think that's a great way of thinking about it. I think that if you want to go away from static dashboards and you want dynamic on demand computations and insights, you do need that. You do need a backend that is going to be powerful, and the backend has to understand the business. It has to understand the analytical operations or functions, is the term I've been using internally in my company. And if all that come together, then yeah, then the UI is just a slick interface where you ask a question and you get back a very powerful answer that you don't have to dig 5 levels deep to understand. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm seeing it happen as well. I think that's probably how it'll eventually morph into, and you can just then tell your chat system to go do something as well, and then it goes and does something in response to that. So
Absolutely.
all exciting stuff, but we have to make it reality and we have to make it reliable, right? That actually can
Absolutely.
do these things correctly.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share your thoughts and experiences around this idea of metric trees and the work that you're doing to help support them. It's definitely a very interesting new addition and a new style of data assets that I think will be very valuable. So I appreciate all the work that you're doing on that, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here and chatting with you.
Thank you for listening, and don't forget to check out our other shows. Podcast.net covers the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used. And the AI Engineering Podcast is your guide to the fast-moving world of building AI systems. Visit the site to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story.
And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends and coworkers.